Dr. Avnish is a Vitreoretina consultant at IQ Super Speciality Hospital at Gurugram, Haryana. He is chairing this session, and his co-chairman is Dr. Purna Chandra, a very good friend of mine and a very well-known VR consultant at Narayan Netralaya, Bangalore. I'll be moderating. I'm Dr. Apurva, VR consultant at MM Joshi Institute, and Karan is a little late. He's working as a consultant at Sitapur Eye Hospital. So now, without further ado, I would just make a blanket request to all the speakers to tell us where you're working and tell us why you chose this topic, what intrigued you about this topic, because interestingly, these topics were submitted by young ophthalmologists from across the country and have been chosen for presentation in this prestigious AIOS session. So, calling first Dr. Digvijay Singh. Please continue with your talk. Go ahead with your talk.
Thank you, Apurva, and it's indeed a pleasure to be part of the UOC session here at AIOC on a virtual platform. I think something that is an amazing conference ongoing, and thanks AIOS for the opportunity. I'm Dr. Digvijay Singh, and I am currently practicing in Gurgaon at Super UOC at the moment. And I am now going to speak to you all about a topic incorporating video consultation in your day-to-day practice and how to get future ready. And the reason I chose this topic is because I think this is something all of us need to do sooner or later. My slides are visible. I'll proceed. So,
yes,
so this is so video consultation has come about in a big way post the lockdown, post COVID pandemic. In fact, a lot of the rules were actually framed after that. Even though video consultations were happening before that, predominantly the ophthalmology field, if you were to look at it, they were happening in the way of connecting renal centers to the parent institute or to the mother institute, or they were happening in the form of cross referrals between two doctors, or sometimes they would happen in terms for a follow-up if somebody had left the city, left the station, left the premises, and they would occasionally get in touch with the doctor. But other than that, really, there wasn't much of teleophthalmology that was happening. But the situation has changed now. And it is now, in fact, the need of the hour for it to happen. And in the current age, it is becoming more and more a standard form of consultation, and more so after the lockdown, and more so during the lockdown periods. That's when people started exploring this option, and they realized that there are certain benefits that this has, and there are certain ways that one can effectively have consultations on the online platform. Now, the rules of telemedicine were actually framed by the MCI or the Board of Governors in March of 2020, just at the time when the lockdown was placed. And the rules are a defined set of guidelines on how to do a telemedicine. And there are certain, so for example, they mentioned that you have to be able to identify the patient and the doctor themselves. There is a certain number of conditions that can be looked at. Nothing invasive can be done. It could just be it could be using audio or a video or a text. It could be asynchronous, which is typically when you do an audio, video, or a chat at the same time. It could be asynchronous in the form of emails. So they kind of have mentioned in their full guidelines, and you can go through these guidelines in the website that I've mentioned, as what counts as telemedicine or teleconsultation, and that who are the people who can do it. And it also gives you certain restrictions within that. It also defines what are the medicines that you can prescribe or the drugs that you can prescribe based into list OAVX, which is medicines of list O can be given ordinarily, which are most of the times over the counter. Then there's a list A of drugs which can be prescribed after video consultation or on the first consultation, and then there is a second list of drugs which can be prescribed on a follow-up consultation or after a video. And then there is a list of drugs that cannot be prescribed. So they've very well defined the whole process. And they've also mentioned how the consents have to be done, whether it's an implied consent if the patient is calling, or it's an explicit, or you have to take a consent if you're the one who's initiated the video consultation. So the question that arises is, why a video consultation? What is the advantages of doing a video consultation? So, and why should we, in our practices, incorporate video consultation? So let's look at the merits. The merits is that a video is better than an audio or a chat form of teleconsultation because the patient-doctor identification is easier. A good patient rapport is there, and there is an ease of examination as well as the ease of counseling and explaining. So this is why a video is better than other forms of teleconsultation, right? And we'll also come to why it will help you in your practice in a bit. The demerits of a video, of course, are that there are privacy concerns. Particularly a patient's picture may be taken, a patient may have, there are certain ethical aspects that need to be looked at, and you require an infrastructure which has a good video camera on both these sides. So sometimes the low resolution ones won't do the trick very much, or if there's no good internet connection, you're unable to do it in a proper manner. What are the suitable situations for a video consultation in the ophthalmology practice? And this has been, this has come in a good article in the Indian Journal of Ophthalmology. And so we know that the first consultation in cases of things which are visible, whether it's a stye or a chalazion or a red eye, is something where this is very helpful. And in my practice, I've done a lot of that now, consults for that. Then you can use it for consultation for optimization of medicine. So I've given a certain eye drop, let's say a patient had dryness, I've given them a certain eye drop, and I want to ask them in a week's time, are you doing better? Do you need more? Do you need less lubrication? And things like that. So to optimize that, or to follow up a patient who's an uncomplicated surgery patient who doesn't have any complaints at all. It can also be used for counseling. So counseling for, let's say, LASIK, counseling in a diabetic patient, for glaucoma, counseling for cataract. So it's something that you can do for counseling as well as for cross consultation with your colleagues. So you can take, the patient can connect with you. You can take some images from the patient, and then you can refer to your colleague and take a cross consultation as well. In trauma, it can be used for first aid and for triaging that, this is urgent, please go to a nearby center. But there are certain unsuitable situations where you should not do it, or there are certain limitations. You cannot, as per the law, use it for invasive procedures or for certain surgeries. You cannot use it for training purposes. You cannot use it for cross-border. You cannot use it for an international patient at the moment. Your prescriptions are not going to be valid. And so on and so forth. There are a few of these unsuitable situations where you should not use video consultation. Now, incorporating in your practice, what is the need for it? So one, it is the need of the hour. Two, it is a source of patient connect even during the lockdown. So it was a major source, right? Because the patients during the during the lockdown could not get in touch with you. They could not come physically. That's where we realized that this is what kept the connect going. And doctors who had shifted to this early, were able to keep their patients with them and well connected. It also expands the catchment area, right, to the whole of the country, because anybody can do a video consultation from anywhere within the country at all. So that was one. It also expands our hours. It gives us a flexibility to work from home, which is something which is very unusual for a doctor in a way. And it also, and as there is a shift in the consumer practice, in the pattern, like the patients who are shifting to an online mode, this is something that you must have in your practices now. How would you go about it? So first, the way to go about it is to set up the infrastructure. So you need to have a good camera, a good screen, a good mic, a good headphone. You need to train your staff to be able to, connect the patient and get them connected to you. You can also do it yourself. Most individual doctors can easily do this yourself. You need to price it. It may not have to be at the same price as your OPD consultations. And in the beginning, the OPD consultations were at a higher price. This was priced very low. Still did not get patients, so they priced it even lower. But now the prices have come back to closer to the OPD consultations for this as well. So you need to strategize your price. Record keeping is very important in this because there are medical aspects and legal aspects, and we'll come to some of those as well. That's a very, very important thing. And it helps you, expand over your practice hours, as well as it's important because you need to market it as well. So you need to, tell people that this is something that you are doing. It can be done through various apps and portals. So we can either do it in the form of a telephony portal, whether it's WhatsApp or Skype or Viber or FaceTime or Zoom, or you could use certain third-party apps that are available, or you could use your hospital's own EMR software, which can now be tuned to do video consultations. So you can use any way. The main tip and trick is that you expand your hours of service. So give more hours for the video consultation, which you could even be at home and do it. Club certain video consultations together. Otherwise, it becomes very disturbing in the day. There's one video, then 3 patients sitting, then another video comes in. So try and club them if possible when people take appointments. Keep a prescription pad ready. Write the prescription there and then, take a photo and send it to the patient. It's very important. You should have a planned first and second line treatment. If I get a red eye, this is what I'll do. If I get a swollen lid, this is what I'll do. Get the patient to assess themselves at home. You can tell them to look at smartphone app. Some apps are available which can help them test their vision at home, help them test their color vision at home. So you could use that. Ask them to send you a photo in advance. And you could use a hybrid model where the patient comes to a clinic or goes to an optometry center, gets their vision done, and then connects with you as well. The demerits, are, as we discussed, that there is a legal implication of this because the accuracy of a diagnosis on video consultation is not as good as what an in-clinic diagnosis is done can do, but unfortunately the legal implications are similar. So a doctor who is diagnosing somebody on a video consultation is as liable as somebody who's done it in the clinic practice. there are ethical and privacy concerns. There are issues with record keeping because it's sometimes it's not easy to keep records of video chats even though you got a prescription, but exactly what had happened, or you don't sometimes write all the details down. So these record keepings becomes difficult, and this does come under Consumer Protection Act as well. And since there is a lack of touch and feel and there is a limitation on drugs, you can't exactly give the same experience or the same advice to the patient as you would normally do. Now, what is the future? And we need to know that the future is now shifting to healthcare at a home concept. All right, which basically means that more and more people are very busy. It's difficult for them to come to the clinics. Keeping the pandemic in mind, more so their mindsets have changed. They realize that they can do certain things at home. And there are a lot of organizations which are providing home visits, particularly on the optometry front. They go into the refractions at home. So people are shifting in trend. So this is one way of catching up with that trend. So the other thing is a lot of devices have now come out in the market, such as the home tonometer that you can see in the center here, or you can see this fundus camera, a smartphone-based adapter, which people can take fundus photos at home and send them to you. So this is again something where the video consultation can adapt, because you tell them that this is a device, you can take a picture. Let's say somebody's a diabetic, needs to do it every 6 months, or somebody's a glaucoma patient, needs an eye pressure check every other week. He can do that from home and get in touch with you as well. Technology is improving in the smartphones. A lot of devices, a lot of apps have come which can help people assess their vision, color vision, Amsler grid, everything on the smartphone. And a lot of people can do it from there. So that's again something that you must know. That there are clinical projects going on by certain companies where they are sending optometrists to people's houses, or sending technicians to people's houses and assessing them and then getting them connected from there by having done a cursory examination. And this is again something where the video consultation is going to really pick up in the future. And now with good quality resolutions, we are coming to a situation where this is going to become a very standard form of consultations at all. So I thank you for your time, and look forward to any discussion on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Digvijay. That was really a talk that was needed in this time. Avnish, do you have comments to make?
I think sir had covered most of the aspects. Sir, just one question. Any of your patients or many bad experiences you would have had with teleconsultations? I think patients, most of them are satisfied. They are more than happy to see you, at least that you are virtually present, and they have that. That actually has a very good effect. But have you had any a bad experience or something which you would want to specifically emphasize? This, because as you are saying, it is definitely having some medical legal sort of a problem. So what sort of patients or what sort of things one should avoid, or maybe keep it in mind when you are actually doing a teleconsult?
So, that's a good point, actually. The two things that patients expect: one, they do expect it to be priced slightly lesser than a clinic consult. So you must ensure that. And second, they do expect you to be on time. So they expect that if they've taken a 3 o'clock appointment, that, and you're logging in at 3, you should be there at 3. There have been times when, you're occupied with another patient in the clinic, and the patient has to wait for 10 minutes, or they logged in and they logged out thinking you aren't coming. And so, sometimes there's a bit of cribbing on that, but then that's part of, how it is. So it helps if there's a staff who logs in and says, doctor is busy, or you give them a message that, I'll log in 10 minutes, or I'll connect in 10 minutes. The other thing is, since there is a limitation on the kind of drugs that you can prescribe, right, on the medicines that you can prescribe, there have been situations where I know that this is possibly a uveitis or a conjunctivitis. We start treating it as a conjunctivitis, but we quickly realize that it's not. And now the patient expects you to be able to give him a certain treatment like a steroid or something else over the video consultation, which as per the norms is not something you can do. And you ask them to come into the clinic. Sometimes that kind of gets a little disturbing for them, that, pehle hi bula lete, what is the, why did we have this process in the first place? So they don't understand the limitations, but that's the kind of two places where they get a little disheartened. But that said, that's probably 1 in 100 cases, not more than that.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Yeah.
Thank you, Ashok. Next one, Ashok.
Dr. Prasanna Venkatesh Ramesh is going to start a neophyte's guide to animation and videography tools.
Yes, without much time, I'll just start my presentation. Just a moment, I'm just... Screen visible now?
No.
Yeah. Just a second, just a moment. So I'm from Trichy. I'm a glaucoma person basically. So then for the next few minutes, I'll be taking you through on how to go about making your own animations and making your own videos for a informative toolbox. And let us have a start.
Good afternoon. My topic is on a neophyte guide to animation and videographic tools. I would like to thank you, Pavilion, for this opportunity. I'm Dr. Prasanna Venkatesh, and let me begin with an animation of the angled recess. So most of the animations all have been made by us, and I'll try to focus on a particular topic of gonioscopy and explore animations and videos as we go. So you see that when we communicate to the patient or when we communicate to the trainee, we really don't know whether they fully understood what we really said them. So that is where I feel metaphorical conceptual learning is very important, because first we show them the animation, then we show them all the structures in the animation, and then we take them into the clinical scenario. As you can see a video on your right hand side, then we will be able to make them understand the concepts really better. As you can see posteriorly, we have the root of iris, ciliary body bands, scleral spur, trabecular meshwork, and the Schwalbe's line anteriorly. So the commonly encountered difficulties such as iris process on your left hand side, they are shown as animations. The peripheral anterior synechiae on your right hand side at various levels can be shown in animations first, and making them understand the concept of this disease pathology. Then when we take them into real-time scenarios, they can appreciate how really an iris process looks. So that really works well. And on the right hand side, you can see the peripheral anterior synechiae. So this is how I feel things can be taught to the residents or fellows, which makes it more simpler. So then I take them into a concept of commonly encountered practical difficulties that we saw, the pathophysiological mechanism, that is iris process only wraps around the angled recess. It does not cause any visualization difficulty to the angles below, nor it causes any difficulty in raised IOP per se. Whereas the peripheral anterior synechiae is pathological because it poses difficulty in visualizing the angles below, as well as it causes raised IOP. So we take them into the concepts further, and then I show them the video of how to do about an indirect gonioscopic examination. Show them a video on the left hand side where you can see the graticule size is reduced to avoid the light falling into the pupil, because if it does so, then we will have a artifactually induced meiosis, which may cause a widened angle. Then we show them the zoomed magnification which is needed to visualize the angles. We have a normal angle and a peripheral anterior synechiae there. Then the slit is put and a corneal mesh technique is demonstrated for the Schwalbe's line. So the grade 3 and grade 4 angles, the normals are first shown first, so that the concepts are first being incorporated better. So once the normal angles are shown, then the grade 2 angle where the root of iris is adjacent to the trabecular meshwork is shown. Then the grade 1 angle on your right hand side where only the pigmented Schwalbe's line is seen. Slowly taking them deeper into the concepts helps a lot. This is a manipulative gonioscopy. When you look at the inferior mirror, you can see that the angle appears to be crowded, but when the patient looks towards the mirror, it opens up. So taking them into the manipulative gonioscopy by showing them videos and telling them what to expect out of it. Then the pupillary block phenomenon, which causes the acute angle closure attack in the first place. So that is why we do the ARC-PA prophylactically, why we do it, and if we don't do it, what happens is shown as animation. And this is a clinical picture of a patient post-acute angle closure attack, where the Oak striate is beautifully seen, glaucom flecken, pigment dispersion, non-reacting pupil, and you have a iris atrophy too. The software that we use to make an animation, that is what I personally use, is an Adobe Flash version CS5. It costs around 2,500. It's available in Proxy 2. That doesn't matter. It's easily accessible. So a square or oval tool can be used. You can make your own square. For example, let us see how to go about it. You can choose a square and make your square and convert it into a rectangle by using the scaling option. For example, you keep it rotated at 37 degrees at frame 1 and you place it in the software. Now, take for example in frame 20, you place the same rectangle in another angulation at frame 20. So filling between the frames can be done by customized, which is very tedious. You have to do from frame 1 to 20 manually, or you can do it automatically. The software takes care of itself, and that's the product you get of the animation. For ophthalmology, we need to have a reference image. That's very important. So take an image of an eye and then do an e-tracing so that you get a good image of the eye. So this is my own e-traced image. You can see that the cross-section of the eye is constructed by tracing with different colors. So I prefer doing it with different colors. And then creating the soft cross-section of the eye can be done alternatively as follows. Very simpler method. Draw two circles, erase the unnecessary curves, and there you get a cross section of the eye. So it can be done in multiple ways. Let us move into a real-time case scenario. A 24-year-old ICL has been implanted. Post-operative day 10. His left eye alone has eye IOP. Is diagnosed with secondary angle closure. PA was done, but still no improvement. He came to us. Gonioscopy revealed a pigmented open-angled meshwork, which is quite normal. So we made the re-diagnosis from secondary angle closure to secondary open angle glaucoma, keeping in mind the normal chamber depth, pigmented open angles, and a good ICL vaulting. And this patient, the possible mechanism that we felt was once the ICL was placed, the patient developed a phenomenon of posterior iris rubbing, maybe with the anterior ICL, and then that caused the pigment to disperse, as seen in this animation. So this animation was created, the patient can be counseled with it, the trainees can be taught, and you can see the pigment dispersing and falling into the trabecular meshwork, causing an occlusion and secondary open angle glaucoma. So the front-on section of the eye, how was it constructed? Layer 1, white sclera with a hole in the center. It's quite simple. Layer 2, add the cornea and the iris. Layer 3, add the vessels of the conjunctiva. Layer 4, insert the iris behind the lens. So that's how we went about going about it. So each layer can be placed one above the other. So this is called the scientific screenplay. Now it's set in motion and it's a dynamic tool for evaluation. The animative module was divided into three parts: dilatation of pupil, insertion of ICL, dispersion of pigments causing glaucoma. So as you can see here, the three part of the animation module is divided, and let us see first how we can dilate the pupil. So we just need to enlarge the central circle larger. So creating the circular pupil can be done with a motion tween tool, where you just need to use it and make sure you enlarge it from frame 1 to frame 80 in this scenario. So frame 1 you have a small pupil, in frame 80 you need a larger pupil. So in the software what we need to do is you just enlarge the pupil by enlarging the circle. Similarly, the visual sequence of ICL implantation is as follows, and in the software similar sequences are employed in different frames. Now the zoom part of it, you zoom without pixelating. That is very difficult, but by vector analysis, that is the vector-based animation softwares, you get a beautiful zoom where there is no pixelation. And finally, we add the pigments. Each pigment had to be added separately. You see there are multiple layers there which we need to work on, which is quite tedious. So the finished product somewhat looks like this, which we already saw. So I'll just show it to you once again. So once the ICL is placed, you can see the rubbing of the iris causing the pigment dispersion. So how to make the pigments move faster? Selecting the number of frames is the key. If you have 5 frames, it moves faster. If you have 10 frames from point A to point B, it moves slower. You see, let us see an animation of that too. See, from 5 frames, it moves very faster. But when you have a 10 frame, you can see how slow it moves from point A to point B. So that's the beauty about animative learning. It's quite interesting actually. Isn't every situation special from a glaucomatologist point of view? PXF, you have sample assist line, angle recession where you have a ciliary body band broadening with iris process tone, and in anaridic patients you have rudimentary iris stump. All these are our videos which we used to show for teaching. Animative teaching, we have SLT versus ALT. Sometimes these concepts need to be taught animatically, where you can show the ALT and the SLT. The spot size you can see in ALT, it's smaller. It is positioned between the pigmented trabecular meshwork and the non-pigmented trabecular meshwork, whereas in SLT the spot size is much more bigger. And this is an eye with normal angle. Then we show an eye with oppositional angles. As you can see here, the eyes with oppositional angle. Then we show them the laser which is done. And you can see once the laser is done, it opens up. I just show it again. Yeah, there it is. So, and then we show them not only the side angle view, we show them the front on view where how the 24 spots are placed over 360 degrees. And then we show them the gonioscopic view and how you place the laser, and you can see how it opens up beautifully. So we just make sure we show them every view possible so that they can understand the concepts much better. And then surgical scenarios, if eye femur is there post trabeculectomy, first you should note a bleeding from the PI, because sometimes if you fail to note a peripheral anterior synechiae there and you do a PI there, then it may tend to bleed. So there you can see the bleeding is from the PI. This is a patent ostium on the left hand side, and this is a blocked ostium on your right hand side with pigments. So all these are surgical videos which you can show them to prime and train them. And this is one of the videos which is actually mimicking an older procedure called Heredin-Kleis's, where one root of the iris is actually into the ostium. So animative metaphorical learning is the future, and in the future we are going to have a lot of e-counseling stations and a lot of e-stations for teaching the youngsters. So most of my videos are there in my YouTube channel. Feel free to visit it. I think you'll find it useful. Thanks for the opportunity once again. Thank you.
Fantastic. Prasanna.
Thank you again for the opportunity, madam and sirs. Yeah. I had to slightly innovate my presentation, as I had another presentation in another hall. So I pre-recorded it in a green mat and made sure I give the audience a live view of what I would want them to see. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your expertise. Dr. Chandra,
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Please ask your questions.
Excellent videos, Dr. Prasanna. So
Thank you,
I
sir.
wanted to ask you, like, there are many youngsters obviously watching this. If someone wants to take up this, like animation and all, how
Yes,
should
sir.
they go about it? Like, do they take formal training? And Adobe, you showed, like, there are paid version, free version. What are the options available for them?
So I would first suggest the youngsters to first start with basic Keynote or Microsoft PowerPoint first, because once we are familiarized with the transitions in the PowerPoint, if they have a Dell or a Mac, if you have the Keynote. So once you are familiarized with the basic transitions in the regular tools that we are using as a scientific person or as an ophthalmic speaker, then they can go for these advanced versions. And there are many friendly versions in the phone too, like easy makeshift animation apps also. Then once they are familiarized with that, I think the Adobe is the final thing where they can go. So start up with Keynote presentations, because Keynote gives you beautiful transitions, dissolve, magic box, multiple things. So I would tell them to start with Keynotes at first before going into an Adobe.
Directly, Adobe will be like too much.
Too much. Yeah,
I know. Like people do diploma on Adobe and all that.
Yeah, true, sir. True.
Yeah.
So my learning started from Keynote only, sir. I was interested in that, then I pursued that course. Yeah.
And I'd like to ask my last question. In the best of possible scenario and worst possible scenario, what should be the learning curve according to you? Like, how long is it going to take? Best and the worst.
Best case scenario, I think maybe a month or two. If they are really into animations, it is not a day's process. It just takes some time. I initially started only with a dissolve. Dissolve was my favorite one. So between two aspects, I used to make sure I used just dissolve and go about it. Then what I did was I used to keep two slides. In one slide, if I keep a small pupil, in the other slide, I'll keep a large pupil, and I'll use the dissolve so that it looks like it is dilating. So this is how I was going about it. So I would say if they can start like this and they can go further, worst case scenario, more than a year, sir, in the worst case scenario, yeah.
Dr. Prasanna, just one thought. I think, do you do workshops? And if you do, please let us know, because I think it will be very fruitful for everyone. So I think we'll get in touch with you later on, and if we can actually do workshops like this, I think it would be very, very helpful.
Definitely, sir. Definitely looking forward to it. And thanks a lot to the Yosi team for this wonderful warm welcome to me and the opportunity. Thank you. Thank you. Great.
I'll just say I was blown away, Prasanna. It was superb. And definitely, if you do put some teaching programs for this, we are all in.
Definitely, Karan. And Karan is my lovely friend from Pondicherry. I think many must not be knowing. I mean, I'm just introducing myself now. But me and Karan, we are known from the Pondicherry days. And thanks a lot, Karan. I would love to do it. Thank you. For want of time, I'll just stop it here. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Prasanna. Great presentation. Next, I have Dr. Kushal Delhiwala, a VR consultant. Please introduce yourself, sir, and please go ahead with your topic, adapting to newer technologies in practice.
Is the screen visible?
Please play the slides.
Yeah, sure. So good afternoon, everyone. I am Dr. Kushal Delhiwala. I am practicing VR consultant at Ahmedabad. I thank AIOC and UC for this opportunity. And my primary aim for choosing this topic was that since the technology is ever evolving, and we all know, as the Heraclitus, the ancient Greek philosopher, has always mentioned, that only thing which is constant is change. So we also need to adapt to the newer technologies in practice. And I thought, since I have adapted newer technology in my practice, I would share my outcomes that will also help us to improve the surgical outcomes as well as the patient satisfaction. So thanks once again, UC. So we all know that what we see in the OR helps us to improve our surgical experience as well as, and it also affects everyone involved in the surgical experience in OR. And we also know that visualization is a very much foundational element of the ophthalmic procedures. Unless and until we see very clearly, we cannot decide what steps we need to perform. So obviously there is always a need that we should recognize the need for better visualization for any of the, be it diagnostic or therapeutic procedures. And we know that the current limitations of the technology available are there, but they are always getting better and better as the times are progressing. So enhancing the visualization isn't just about enhancing the procedures and outcomes. It also helps us to have finding of new solutions and newer treatments.
I think
So
the
this
slides
is
are
what,
blurred. I think is it same for everyone?
Kushal,
Yeah.
what is happening is you have optimized for video. Could you
Okay.
unshare and reshare
Okay,
without
okay.
optimizing for video? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I'll do that. Sorry for that. Just a minute. So is it better?
Yeah, very clear now. Thank you.
Yeah. So I will be sharing my experience with the recent visualization 3D system. And primarily these systems were invented for the vitreoretinal surgery, but nowadays they have been extensively used for the various ophthalmic procedures. So let us meet the two systems available in the market. So the first one was the TrueVision system, which was renamed as Ingenuity 3D visualization system, that is being marketed by Alcon. And the another one, the latest in the armamentarium, is the RTO 800 model by Carl Zeiss. However, the most widely reviewed one is the 3D visualization system by Ingenuity, which is widely reviewed in the literature. And since I also have an experience to share with the Ingenuity, let us meet the Ingenuity system. So basically, it's an integration of three new technology components which are integrated in our conventional traditional operating microscope. So those three things include the HDR 3D camera. So it's a high definition camera with two sensors of 1920 by 1080 sensors, and it has got speed of 60 frames per second per eye with CMOS sensors. So this is fitted over our conventional binoculars. We have to replace it in the Ingenuity system. However, the RTO has got a benefit of incorporating the 3D camera as well as the binocular simultaneously. The second part of this system is the ultra high speed imaging processor, which gives us almost nil lag, because the lag currently in these systems is less than 70 milliseconds, which is not perceived by the brain. So we feel that it's a real time frame. What we do in the OT, the surgical steps, they are exactly seen on the screen as a live. So it has also got facility to have inbuilt recording systems as well as the stream 3D as well as 2D simultaneously also. The third part of the system is the 3-dimensional 4K projection. It's a medical grade OLED surgical display. It's a huge 55-inch screen. And again, it has got a facility of simultaneous 60 FPS projection. And integrating all these three components, we have to wear a passive circular glasses of Polaroid 3D, which we are all familiar with the 3D movies, which we used to go into the theaters to watch. And that looks like a past now. So basically our brain basically helps us with the principle of binocular disparity, where the images of both the eyes are projected, and using the 3D technology, they are simultaneously merged and it gives us the 3D technology. So here we can see the right eye sees this images, the left eye sees this images, and using the 3D technology, they are both put together to give you a 3D index. So we can see there are advances in the display systems as well, where initially we had these televisions which were of standard definition of 480, then came the enhancements, and subsequently they have evolved to ultra high definitions where we can have a huge projections, and that also includes the improvement in the outcomes as well. So what are the advantages? Yeah, so we have this so there is an extended field of depth. So depth of field basically means that the distance between the nearest and the farthest objects that are acceptably sharp focus. Here we can see this is the near object, this is the far object. So they are very much crisply focused irrespective of at all magnifications. So that gives a beautiful depth to us. Also, there is an enhanced magnification performance. We get a 19% greater magnification at all depths, and it also gives a 19% finer depth resolution. Then this is the creating the optimized HDR exposure, the high dynamic range, which we talked about the existing two camera sensors on the Ingenuity. Here we can see this is overexposed light, and here it's underexposed light. But the beauty of these HDR cameras is that it balances both of them to prevent the glare as well as shadows, and you can get the all details very much finer, as well as the colors are also highlighted very effectively. And this probably does help in certain situations like performing laser photocoagulation or any surgical task under the air in posterior segment surgeries. So here we can see the outcomes in the video recording also. This is a standard conventional video recording system where the color of the vessels is pretty much looking lighter, but this is the outcomes which we can see on the recorded version of the Ingenuity system as well. So that is the beauty of this technology. And the recent advances is that the data fusion has been done by the Alcon company, where they have integrated the Alcon Constellation visual system into this Ingenuity. So we get all the overlays on the projection monitor. So no one, the surgeon has to not to look at the parameters into the machine. They can get all the parameters simultaneously on the screen. And we can also see that the uniform illumination is there, be it in the periphery as well as the center. So we can see all the things crisp and clear. So all in all, the display monitor is placed usually in the proximity of the dorsal end of the patient's trolley. The preferable distance should be 1.5 meters. So here I am sitting at my microscope at the head end of the patient, and this is my Ingenuity screen. And it is also an advantage for the visualization for both the surgeon as well as all the participants within the OR. Again, a great teaching tool for the fellows as well. So everyone can know what is happening within the eye. And the biggest advantage, which I believe is also an improved posture using the heads-up display. Because we all know there have been a lot of publications where they have talked about the ergonomics for the ophthalmologists. There are a lot of especially posterior segment surgeons who have cervical spondylosis issues as well. So this is again a nice tool for having this late onset problems with our practice. So if we look at the current literature available, this is a recent article which has been published by a group from Nagpur, where they have shared their experience of using this technology beyond the vitreous, and they did a prospective study of 313 eyes where they had an initial glitches during the pre-learning phase. But once the learning phase was over, there was no apparent problem performing any sort of surgeries, be it an anterior segment procedure or the posterior segment. And another latest recent literature from European journal, they have massive cases of 5,483 eye procedures where they had equally divided and compared with the 3D and the conventional traditional operating microscopes, and they had 100% of their surgeons involved in this survey, where they again had a similar experience of performing 3D, be it for the anterior segment or the posterior segment, without any hesitation. So I would just like to share a brief clip of the various surgeries which are being performed at our center. To begin with the conventional posterior segment surgery, here I am performing diabetic vitrectomy, where we can see very nicely all the membranes, and we can go beneath with significant enhanced depth perception with segmentation of the membranes. And we will see how the utility of our 3D system is being used even for the anterior segment surgeries. So here, this is another advantage where we have color filters in this Ingenuity system, where we can have a better appreciation for the membranes. So we can see the colors are changing here. There is a red, free, blue and yellow filter, which helps us to identify the membranes very nicely, and thereby it enhances our surgical outcomes as well. So this is the red free filter which I am using for the membrane peeling procedure. And we can see the enhanced magnification where each and everything is pretty much crisp for the appearance. These are, mind you, all the 2D surgeries. Otherwise, this is basically not possible to show 3D unless we have 3D projection on the laptop. So I have converted all these surgeries into 2D. So this is something which I am doing for RD surgery. This is the encirclage which I am doing. Here you can see the colors, as well as we can see all the procedures being performed for the anterior segment. So I am making scleral tunnels for passing the 240 band, and all this being performed using this 3D surgery system. So coming to the IOL surgery, this is one of the case where I had a retrieved dislocated IOL, and I was doing iris claw IOL. So here we can see there is no hesitation. Just 1 minute. Yeah. So this is a keratoplasty being performed for a combined case of vitrectomy by my anterior segment corneal surgeon with a great magnification. This is an entropion surgery being performed by an oculoplastic surgeon. The tarsal texture procedure. And this is again a trabeculectomy performed by a glaucoma surgeon at our center, where we can see the significantly enhanced magnification using the 3D system. So everything comes with the limitations. Yeah, just last slide. That though there are issues related to the purchasing, you need an enough OR space, and time lag probably something which people were talking initially, but it is now been solved. And you need to also look into the disruption to the workflow if a surgeon does not get accustomed with this technology. Last slide. So as long as we use an optical microscope, though surgery cannot be more high tech than the surgeon's brain, but with this 3D visualization system, we can harness the power of artificial intelligence to assist us. Thanks again for this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Kushal. I use 3D system myself, and I think Dr. Purna does also use the 3D system. So one of my questions to you, we'll keep it very short because we are behind the schedule. I want to ask Dr. Purna Chandra this as well. Do you really believe in the parfocality of this system? As in, when I start my surgery, I am advised to zoom in completely, focus till I see blood flow in the conjunctival capillaries, zoom out. That's supposed to ensure parfocality for the entire surgery for posterior pole also. I don't believe this. Do you?
No, I don't.
Same here, same.
Same. I think most of us who are operating for more than 6 months will agree with that. So that's how I suggest. But having said that, I also want to suggest again, many youngsters are watching. I mean, this 3D technology, it's good, but it's not like a must. In case if you don't have at your place and all that, with others also you can equally do a good job. And he showed the papers of advantages, but there are papers of disadvantages of 3D viewing also, which are published based on this PVR movie theaters and all that. But of course, with time you do get used to it. And also, if you need to keep the investment point of also, like most of us are working institution, it will be good. But don't be under the impression if this is going to be the future. If I don't operate in 3D, my surgical skill is going to go down. It's not like that. So, of course, definitely, if you have it, nothing like it.
Absolutely. I think fellows are training on it as well. So what am I going to do without 3D now? Right. So can we have our next speaker, please? Avnish, you want to introduce the next speaker? Are you there?
Just a quick update, Dr. Apurva, that we have 45 minutes to go.
Yeah. Okay, the next speaker, please. Who's the next speaker?
I guess Dr. John Davis is ready.
Yeah. John, absolutely. Dr. John Davis is the innovator of Indian ophthalmology. I think he has multiple publications to his credit about some nook and cranny of a device that he has figured it out. So John is a very good friend of mine. Please, John, go ahead and tell us why you chose this topic.
Thank you so much. My specialty is actually glaucoma anterior segment. That is what I'm fellowship trained in. But if you ask others, my specialty is probably technology in ophthalmology, innovations and technology in ophthalmology. Why I chose this topic is because when you think about the future, if you look at what a young ophthalmologist needs to know about their future, we have to know about artificial intelligence. This is very, very important. Right now, I'm a senior resident and a glaucoma consultant at Sri Ramchandra Medical College, Chennai, and also Western Eye Hospital, Cochin, which is my family's hospital. And Ramchandra Medical College has an engineering college started 2 years back. And that engineering college has only 4 courses. In BTech, only 4 courses. That is BTech Computer Science with Artificial Intelligence and Machine Learning, BTech Computer Science with Machine Learning and Cybersecurity. And the other 2 are also very similar, Computer Science, Internet of Things, and technologies like that. So this is an engineering college specifically dedicated to that. So the future is here. That's what I want to tell you. I suppose a lot of you have heard about the definitions of artificial intelligence. This is just a branch of computer science which deals with the simulation of intelligent behavior in computers. Within that, machine learning is when you try to make the computers learn by themselves. So machine learning is a misnomer. This is what humans learn. So when a baby tries to understand the environment and learn by itself, that is what machine learning is. Deep learning, artificial neural networks are the same in detail. About our present time, that is now and not the future. Now is the fourth industrial revolution, which is cyber physical systems. All of you know about the first one, which was about steam engines. Second was about mass production. Third was about computers and automation. We are in the fourth, and soon we will come to the fifth. So this is a timeline of AI. There is a lot of things which happened, which is not important. If we think that AI is not around us, just look around. All these things are AI. Of course, the smart devices, the smart speakers, the email filters also use AI. They learn and understand which is spam, which is not. You have seen all these robots, and this is from Boston Dynamics, and Boston Dynamics has been bought by Hyundai. So Hyundai, the car manufacturer, may come out with some Transformers type of robot soon. And you know, Elon Musk, everywhere there is AI in this world. And this machine learning and AI has the potential to improve the accuracy and quality of medical care. A lot of big companies, Google, IBM, Microsoft, all are into the medical aspect of artificial intelligence. If you didn't know already, ophthalmology is what we know, but all these branches have a lot of artificial intelligence being done. And I know that we have mostly seen diabetic retinopathy and glaucoma being the the poster childs of artificial intelligence ophthalmology. But it is not only that. ARMD, ROP, vascular occlusions, keratoconus, cataract, refractive errors, RD, squint, progression of squint, ocular cancers, all these have AI. IOL power calculations, we know that it is not very accurate. I mean, it was not very accurate, and we try all sorts of complicated things to get it to match with the actual power needed. But with AI, it is going to be very accurate. We can use it for planning intravitreal anti-VEGF injections. How many injections does the patient need? But there are even more things. We can detect cognitive impairment. That is my wife's thesis topic. Dementia, Alzheimer's disease, risk of stroke, cardiovascular risk from just fundus photographs or OCTs. You can, diabetic retinopathy already has, an FDA approved software, IDXDR, or incorporated on a fundus camera. And Medios has an offline AI. This is the one which Professor Natarajan Sundaram has published about. And this is the one which is there in the fundus on phone from Remedio, no financial interest. All these are really available right now. Netra.ai, Pegasus. Pegasus is the one which is available. I will show you where it's available. It's there on the Orbis website. Glaucoma OCTs, the glaucoma contact lens sensor, the Sensimet triggerfish for detecting cupping and detecting whether a particular fundus is supposedly glaucomatous or not, differentiating it from glaucoma suspect. All these can be done by AI, which cannot be done by human ophthalmologists. So visual fields criteria and analyzing visual fields can be done by AI. There was one study which was able to predict the future. Okay, so this particular AI system was able to predict the future visual fields for around 5.5 years based on the target IOP. So if a patient wants to know what will happen, you can tell them. ROP tool, and these are the ROP softwares which use AI for ROP analysis. ARMD, not only from photos and OCTs, you can also predict the visual acuity. You can predict the requirement of anti-VEGF. These are things which are very important. Patients will need to know these things, and an ophthalmologist cannot really tell, and the AI will be able to tell you that. Vascular occlusions can be identified, and this is natural. But this particular thing, you can predict the OCT macular edema from a fundus photo without doing an OCT. So if you have only a fundus photograph, you can tell what the OCT will be. So of course, OCT uses a lot of AI, and other retinal diseases like RRT, retinal detachment, PEDs, corneal disorders, keratoconus, early keratoconus, and to say whether it will progress or not. All these softwares, all these machines can use AI softwares integrated. And also for biomechanics, things which are new, which we don't know much about, AI is going to help us make sense of the enormous data being generated by new machines. Cataract can be detected from just standard digital camera photographs. Of course, we can grade cataract from slit lamp images, but also from ultrasound, also from fundus photos based on how much haziness is there. And also it can predict the risk of PCO. This is all by AI analysis of pictures, right? And pediatric ophthalmology, not only for the cataract diagnosis, also squint and refractive error. You can also predict future high myopia. You can predict what will be the progression of myopia. LV Prasad Eye Institute has a study on this, which is quite a couple of years old. And it can detect leukocoria from recreational photograph, that is photos, just normal photographs. You can plan squint surgeries. Oncology, you can demarcate the border of squamous neoplasm from unstained specimens, because the images have subtle changes which cannot be seen by the human eye, and also helps in reconstruction. Refractive error, as I said, you can predict based on ocular biometry, height, weight, and other parameters. And why AI is important? It is faster, cheaper, scalable, portable, and it helps when there is a doctor shortage, and it does not need rest, does not get bored. Hope it just assists humans and does not take over our jobs. But I know that it will be there in the future for sure. Thank you.
Fantastic talk, Dr. John. That was very insightful about the way to go forward and how AI is probably going to take over in the next few years across subspecialties in ophthalmology. My question to the moderators, Dr. Purna Chandra, what is your experience with AI in retina? Are you using it for any reason? What usage?
Yeah, when that AI first came, that Google was doing the project, we were part of that. In fact, we have graded almost some 50,000 images, and also in ARMD. So some basic problems what we had, especially ARMD, like for example, if there is a drusen, it will tell it is an hard exudate. Those are the things which have been to a large extent taken care of now. So that is it's a way to go, but as he rightly said in the last, I'm worried whether it is going to make us jobless. Like in future, if you go to a mall, there will be an Optos like machine will be sent. You put a coin, place your eye, it will say whether you have lattice, diabetic retinopathy. Anyway, that's on a lighter side. But A is the way to go actually. So of course the doctor shortage and all that, I don't think it's going to exist in another 5 years. We're looking at the number of medical colleges, what we are giving the sanctions and all. So that's my take on AI.
Right. Dr. Karan, any thoughts?
Definitely AI is the way to go. And I have one thing, if John, if you could work something on related to corneal ulcers, because particularly in the periphery, it gets very difficult and everybody doesn't know how to deal with it. However, the spectrum is very different in comparison to a DR spectrum. So it is going to definitely take over, and it is for the future. Excellent talk again, John.
Thanks, Karan, for the idea. I think I will link my smartphones and AI together, and smartphone slit lamp photography, AI. I'll work on it.
Maybe we can work together on it.
Okay. Fine. Can you take off the timer, please? Yeah, so the next talk is by Dr. Sagnik Sen. I believe he's a VR fellow at Aravind Eye Hospital, Madurai. Sagnik, please tell us why you chose this topic and what you're going to speak about.
Can you see my screen?
You're audible also, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Apurva. Thank you, Yossi, for inviting me for this talk today. I am Sagnik, and I am a VR fellow, a research and clinical fellow at Aravind Eye Hospital in my final year right now. I chose this topic because, like Dr. John said, that AI platforms are coming up a big way as predictive modalities. So we need to know which patient is going to respond to a treatment, which patient has a risk of development of a disease. So I'm going to look at this same aspect from a biotechnology, biochemistry point of view. So personalized medicine for ophthalmic diseases, use of omics related big data. We know that over 80% of proteins predicted by the human genome have been identified, and only 2% of the genome is coded, and rest all are non-coding DNA. And the omics platforms are basically genomics. So we have DNA, which involves the genomics. Then we have transcription into mRNA, which is transcriptomics, and proteins, expression of proteins, which is called proteomics. And there's something called epigenetics, which controls the transcription of DNA into mRNA. Now, coming into what is personalized medicine, Professor Lee Hood at the Institute of Systems Biology in Seattle had defined personalized medicine as predictive, preventive, personalized, and participatory. So P4 medicine. It is a medicine, type of medicine in which departments of medicine, chemistry, biochemistry, and other technological departments like bioinformatics, manufacturing, and computing come together and utilize multiple skills and technologies to help patient care. And aims of personalized medicine are to tailor the treatment to the individual characteristics of the patient, rather than the current approach of stratifying patients into treatment groups based on how the patient's phenotype is. And personalized medicine will also address both health and disease. So we have something called as personalized health and personalized medicine, which deals with diseases and treatment. So this is basically a diagram which shows how traditional medicine treats. So we have like males, females, age group wise, we deal with very broadly. But in personalized medicine, we will deal with specific age groups, specific DNA mutations, phenotypes, specific race. So suppose we have drug A, B, and C, and we do a diagnostic test or a prognostic test, which tells us that a certain percentage of population is responder to drug A, and another certain percentage of population is non-responder. So we choose our drug A, B, and C based on whether the patient will respond or whether the patient can have severe side effects also. The final vision of personalized medicine is if a patient has a diagnostic test positive and is likely to benefit, then we give the treatment to that patient. Otherwise, we don't. We titrate a therapy which will be useful for that particular patient. And we know that response to drugs is affected by each component in the omics family. Like certain genotypes might be resistant to certain drugs, or they may have side effects. So personalized medicine has been extensively used in cases of cancers like melanoma, lung cancer, and colon cancer. So we already know that estrogen receptor status, HER2/neu status, BRCA gene, all these positive. If this particular gene comes positive, then the patients receive some chemotherapy which cannot be given otherwise. Where does proteomics come into this picture? So proteomics is basically, as I said, it's a study of all the proteins. Proteomics, so proteins can be detected by sensitive assays, nanoproteomics, and it can be, so we can study proteome expression along with the genotype of the patient. We can develop them into biomarkers or diagnostic therapeutic tests, and finally we can have something called as a personalized medicine. You know that genome can be studied using the Sanger sequencing methods. Proteome can be studied with mass spectrometry, Western blotting, and ELISA. And finally, the phenotype is the clinical disease manifestation of a patient. So today we are going to talk about these three methods: mass spectrometry, Western blotting, and ELISA. Here is a representative diagram of a lung cancer patient. So we do genotyping for the patient, genotyping and proteome matching. So after we analyze proteome, we compare with different kinds of lung cancers in the patient, and then finally we study protein-protein interaction databases, and we personalize the treatment strategy for the patients. Here is another example of a rare disease. It's a neovascular inflammatory vitreoretinopathy, which has 5 stages. So here you can see a heat map. Heat map is basically interaction network of different proteins in different samples. So as you can see that as we go from control to stage 1, stage 2, these color maps are changing. That means these are the proteins which are differently expressed in different stages. So the author studied VEGF levels according to stages, and they found that in the last stage, VEGF levels are maximally raised. So they gave anti-VEGF to the patients, and they found that after anti-VEGF, the inflammation status of the patients reduced. Again, they found the patient of the last stage, so the patient had exudative retinal detachment with traction membranes. They found that IL-6 levels were extremely high in the last stage. You can see from this ELISA picture also. So along with retinal detachment surgery, they gave anti-IL-6 injections to the patient. Patient responded well. So this is something called as a drug repositioning. So we already know the indications, the commonly known indications of drugs. Repositioning means we are selecting drugs for an indication which is not yet known. So usage of already approved drugs for undescribed indications. And this can be easily done by taking liquid biopsies from patients like vitreous, aqueous humor, and finally blood and urine samples if we can trace those same protein expression patterns in the blood. Genetic testing may have limits because genotyping only estimates the disease acquiring risk. However, proteomic profiling of liquid biopsies identifies the real-time effectors of expressed genes. So we can actually understand whether the patient will respond or not respond to the drug based on the expression profile. Now, my work at Arvind was basically involving vitreous from patients. So we found that found 552 unique proteins which have not been described till now. This was on donor eyes. Now, why did I choose vitreous? Because vitreous is an immunologically isolated body fluid. It is formed at the embryonic stage and changes very little in basic composition. So any disease which is happening in the retina will definitely get expressed in the vitreous, because since vitreous is an isolated cavity. So candidate disease for today is diabetic retinopathy. We all know that diabetic retinopathy, different kinds of pathogenetic pathways have been described, like the PKC activation pathway, hexosaminidase pathway, age-range pathway. And finally, it leads to a breakdown of BRB, which has all the pathogenic markers like basement membrane thickening, pericyte loss, inflammation. So this is my lab, and this is a mass spec machine in which we will study the proteome expression of patients. Coming to the analysis. So I analyzed control vitreous, like normal macular hole vitreous, which is a non-inflammatory control, and PDR vitreous as disease state. So the first picture, the A labeled picture, is a principal component analysis. Principal component analysis separates the proteome datasets into different groups. As you can see that the PDR samples, the ones in red, and the MAC hole samples have separated. Beside that, we have a heat map. So the first two columns has MAC hole samples, the control samples, and the next two columns has PDR. So you can see that the proteome expression profile of the two diseases is completely different. And we can also do a network analysis in which different kinds of protein interactions are enriched. Some statistical analysis is performed which can tell us which functions in the proteome are high. Suppose we have a proteases are raised, or inflammatory pathways are raised, or complement activation pathways raised. So we can understand all those things also from proteome analysis. This is a pathway analysis, again, which tells us which pathways are hyper expressed or which pathways are down regulated in this particular proteome. So what we found that PDR proteome has an increased function of protease inhibition, inflammation, WNT signaling, coagulation fibrinolysis, and reduced function of anti-angiogenesis. So and angiogenesis is increased. Then neuroinflammation inhibition, antioxidant activity, etc. So I will give you a situation in the year 2050. Suppose two patients aged 50 years, and each of them get diagnosed with mild NPDR in both eyes. And we sample their blood and we test it for the entire proteome mapping. And the report I'll show you, we have to understand how we can predict each patient's PDR risk status. So you see that proteome from non-diabetic patients and non-retinopathy diabetic patients are on the left side of the diagram, the principal component analysis. On the right side, we have VTDR. So patient 1's proteome matches with no diabetes and non-retinopathy diabetes. So this patient is at a lower risk of progression. Whereas patient 2, although he has mild NPDR today, his proteome dataset is enriching with the PDR proteome dataset. So we can say that patient 2 is going to be at a higher risk of developing PDR in the near future. So we treat the patient 2 accordingly. And right now, mild NPDR and moderate NPDR has no treatment per se other than diabetic control and systemic control. However, in the future, we might have newer drug molecules which can treat moderate NPDR, for example. So then if we can detect those patients who are at a higher risk of developing PDR, then we can treat those patients early. This was an abstract which we got, which got accepted in ARVO last year. So we identified one protein, retinol binding protein 3, which is down-regulated in PDR samples. It was consistently coming up. So we chose this protein to study in other samples. RBP3 is expressed in photoreceptors. And so basically we want to try and detect if RBP3 can be a prognostic biomarker for diabetic retinopathy.
Doctor, I appreciate we are out of time.
Yeah, I'll just round up. So as you can see that PDR samples have a low expression of RBP3. And this is a p-value is also significant. PDR samples have low RBP3. So RBP3 is basically a prognostic marker. So what are the essential future goals? We can develop biomarkers for diseases for early risk identification or candidates for treatment, associate with artificial intelligence platforms to improve prediction ability, find prognostic markers for diseases, search for newer targets for drug development, and drug repurposing or repositioning can also be done. However, drawbacks for this method is we'll generate huge amounts of data, and we need servers, either solid servers or cloud state servers with ample amounts of data saving capacity, and we need heavy computing power for the same. And we need a very strong clinical.
Doctor, can I suggest you please wrap it up?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Apurva, over to you.
Next, we have Dr. Nilesh. I'll have questions for you in the chat box, Sagnik. Nilesh, start your talk.
Dr. Apurva, how many speakers left?
2 more.
2 more. We have 20 minutes to go.
Yeah. So I request you to screen your slides beforehand and maybe skip over the unnecessary ones if there are any.
Yeah, sure, ma'am. I'll try to keep it as short as possible.
Thank you, Nilesh.
Thank you, ma'am. Good afternoon, everyone. A big thanks to AIOS Scientific Committee and UCGC for conducting this event and this session and giving me this opportunity. I'm Dr. Nilesh Kumar, a comprehensive ophthalmologist, and I am here to talk about blockchain and its implication in healthcare. Is that the future? When with one tweet of Elon Musk, the Bitcoin crashed spectacularly, I started reading about the blockchain for just some juicy gossip. But as I read more and more, I was just fascinated with the use case it has. As an innovator, it was my area of interest to watch out for whatever is pushing the envelope. So here is the talk. These are my financial disclosures, and none of them are going to clash with today's talk. So imagine this, one patient strolls into your OPD, 15-year diabetics with no health record. Whatever you do, you are not going to find EMRs, the health record. What if the patient gives you an ID and you have all the records in the system instantly, but the hospital can't misuse the data because all the data is encrypted and the patient will allow the hospital to decipher the data only for a limited time. And also they can only have the info what they need. The hospital, though, will have the data they create and encrypt completely safe with them. Now the patient undergoes evaluation and was found to have PDR. The entire data from patient record gets uploaded, and the patient, when applies for Mediclaim, gets an instant approval. And this is not some petty approval of 2K or 5K that is advertised by insurance company. It is instant approval for the entire amount of claim that is going to happen. And the money gets instantly credited from the pharmacy, from the insurance company to the pharmacy, and the pharmacy gives out the drug. Now imagine the patient can track the authenticity of the drug right from the manufacturing to the entire transportation, including the temperature and other quality control. Isn't that just amazing? So all that can happen with one piece of technology that is called blockchain. Now, what is blockchain? First thing first, blockchain is not Bitcoin, but Bitcoin is just one of the application of blockchain, the first and the most controversial one. Blockchain is growing list of records, which are called blocks and are all linked together by a code using cryptography. Now that sounds very simple. Is it just a sham? Is that why Bitcoin is so controversial? How will something that basic will do all the things that was told in the intro? It turns out it can. Everyone must have heard of this before. Data is the new oil, but actually data is simply a crude oil. You can't do anything. The data, unless processed and analyzed, won't make us any wiser, and we can't put all that knowledge into action. The blockchain gives us the data all encrypted. Let's see how it works. It is a distributed ledger system. That means each node of the system will have a copy of all the encrypted data. Unlike centralized system where there is a risk of cyber attack, there are multiple copies, so nobody can give the threat to us that your data is going to be hacked. When a user makes a transaction, which means any action, like in healthcare, it can be entry into EMR, investigation, financial transaction, etc. It is time-stamped and encrypted and is logged in a block, only to be decrypted by a specific hash key, and is broadcasted to the entire network where it can join the chain, forming the blockchain. A public blockchain is where anyone can join the network and become a node. A private blockchain can be something like an intra-hospital network where all the blocks that store that are in the nodes, which are approved only by the administrator. A consortium, a blockchain is a series of private blockchain joined together by a governing authority. Like the example I cited earlier is an example of consortium blockchain, where a series of hospitals, insurance providers, pharmaceutical companies may be linked together under something like a health ministry or some autonomous bodies. Now coming to a very important concept which will help preventing the data from being misused. In the first example, if we find the patient to have PDR and needs approval from the insurer for the procedure, that is PRP, currently we have to send so much information and they keep asking for FFA and all. But what they only need to know is that is there a proof that the patient is having PDR, and is the patient diabetic? That's two. So what we need to give them is just two information. They already know the patient is diabetic from the previous record. What we need to show them is the area of neovascularization. We don't need to give them anything. With this, they will come to know that this is coming from a blog that has been created only half an hour before. So it is time stamped. It is not that we are going to use somebody else's photograph for it. So they will have a zero knowledge of what the patient actual condition is, who the patient is. All that will happen with zero knowledge. So the data is completely protected with the patient and the hospital, and they will get an instant approval. This all and more will happen with smart contracts. A smart contract is a self-executing contract with the terms of agreement between a buyer and seller being directly written into the code. The code and the agreement contain therein exist across a distributed blockchain network. So apart from the previous part, smart contract will also analyze the cost of therapy, cross-check with the available limit of insurance, and automatically make the payment to the hospital, which will be credited instantly to the hospital. All because the terms are already written in the code and verified by the software. So it is going to be fast, effective, and prevent any insurance or financial fraud. Now coming to one of the most vital part of the practice, that is ethics. Ethics mandates us to perform any procedure and share the patient data only after patient consent. But the consent is not treated with respect as it should be. Also, the paying parity drives the pharmaceutical research so you seldom see R&D happening in our country. This is a big bias in clinical research that exists. Also, the publication of any research is biased because of the editor-in-chief want to only publish the positive results. These are the three things that are going to happen. The concept of consent instead of consent is arising with blockchain. It is the possibility of the use of blockchain by patient or healthy citizen to participate in the scientific process, either by donating or selling their data to relevant research process, or buying such data, or by participating into various extent in the conduct of the research. With blockchain, the patient will be the owner of data, and only with his consent, the data will get decrypted for the agreed upon time. Using a pseudonym, the pharmaceutical companies won't get to know the location, ethnicity, etc., which create the bias. They will only know the patient is having of say PDR thanks to the zero knowledge proof. And if the patient gives consent, they will automatically get enrolled if they meet the inclusion and exclusion criteria thanks to the smart contracts. Smart contracts could also automatically trigger a use of request of reconsent in cases of major protocol change. Patient who wish to revoke or modify their consent could also be directly do so by blockchain, so they can immediately get out of the system upon their wish. Upon study completion, the result will become public automatically. Now, each data has been verified and is authentic, that we know for sure thanks to blockchain. So we are practically eliminating the need of journal peer-reviewed journal who guess that the data they are going to publish is genuine. So isn't the future amazing? Wrong. This is not the future. This is already here. We are already the early adopters. Any innovation adoption cycle has initial innovators and early adopters who make the most of it and become the leaders. Rest of all just follow the trend. Financial Solution has already adopted the technology. In 13 banks in India last week form a consortium, that is Indian Banks Blockchain Infrastructure Company. Amazon has already adopted blockchain for their procurement and warehousing. There are at least 30 EMR solutions across the globe, including Nano Healthcare Token and Plenum Data in India. So it is already here. We just need to have an early adoption. Is it all rosy? No, there are some downsides. Distributable ledger doesn't mean distributable computation power. Each node has to have his own computer, and so a lot of computational power is required. It makes it costly and have a large carbon footprint. And if there are too many data nodes, it will be slow for many users. But there are so many upsides that these can be worked on. So thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Nilesh. That was wonderful. Let's have the questions in the chat box. Now we have Dr. Deepika Parmeshwarappa. She'll be speaking about inherited retinal diseases and their genetics. Deepika, are you ready? Yeah.
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yes, and visible. Slides are visible.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Very good afternoon to all. I'll be speaking on genetics in ophthalmology. I have chosen this topic because almost half of the diseases in ophthalmology are directly related to genetics. So with advancement of the molecular genetics, it is must for everyone to understand the genetics. So quickly, I'll go ahead with my objectives. These are my objectives for today's topic. I'll be discussing all of them one by one. First objective is what is the need of ocular genetics. The eye is, sorry, one second. Eye is second only to brain in its frequency of involvement in genetic disorders. All over the world, approximately 1 in 1,000 people are affected with genetic eye diseases. Almost 50% of pediatric blindness is directly related to genetic etiology. So this is the burden of genetic eye disorders, which necessitates its understanding. A decade back, we clinicians used to end up saying patients that there's no cure for your problem because it's a defect of gene. Well, times have changed with the advent of when FDA approved RP65 gene therapy for the inherited retinal degeneration. And this major breakthrough strengthened the hopes of gene therapy. We do see all these disorders from anterior segment to posterior segment in our day-to-day practice, which are directly linked to genetics, and the list is very long. World has changed from morphology-based to gene-based classification. Approaching a disease along with inheritance pattern and genetics leads to accurate diagnosis, thereby accurate management. Hence, it is crucial for all of us to understand the genetics of eye disorders. My second objective is very short. That is on basics of genetic defects. Changes in the sequence of nucleotides within the gene result in protein malfunction, abnormal phenotype, and disease, which is called as mutation. Third objective is on the role of genetic counseling and pedigree charting. Genetic counseling is a pretty critical part of genetic evaluation, with pedigree playing a major role by providing a clue to pattern of inheritance and also identifying at-risk family members. Also, it gives idea on constricted gene pool when there are ethnic similarities and consanguinity. Genetic counseling also includes counseling on reproductive options and guides for specific diagnostic testing. These are the various types of inheritance which we have been studying way back from medical school. My fourth objective is on the role of genetic counselor. Genetic counselor acts as a bridge between clinician and patients. He or she describes the concept of genetics and DNA to patients, evaluates the motivations for undergoing genetic testing, draws a detailed pedigree diagram, counsels patients regarding ethical concerns, addresses the apprehensions of patient, and also explains the various types of genetic testing and their role. Last objective is genetic testing, why and when. It's to find answers for the following questions for our patients, that is genotypical diagnosis, genotype-phenotype correlation, knowledge on progression of the disease, knowledge on future risk occurrence in the family, identify treatable systemic entities, and a probable future cure by solving the problem at root cause. How does genetic testing performed? It's performed on blood or other tissues to identify the changes in chromosomes, genes, or proteins. The primary approach for investigation of genetic eye disorders is through next generation sequencing. These are the major types of sequencing. Whole genome sequencing provides all the information which is there in the entire DNA, that is the genome. Whole exome sequencing covers a proportion of genome. Targeted ophthalmic panel, also referred to as clinical exome sequencing, specifically captures the defects in particular gene responsible for the disorders. Example, retinal dystrophy panel, congenital cataract panel, etc. So which sequencing to do for genetic eye disorders? Do we want to know the whole genome? Absolutely not necessary. Do we want to know the exome? Whole exome sequencing is only indicated when both ocular and systemic features are not coming together as a single disorder. In that case, yes, we can go for whole exome sequencing, but most of the times in our clinics, one is able to come up with a strong morphological diagnosis to look for specific genes. In that case, whole exome sequencing is absolutely not necessary. So one can only do a targeted gene sequencing for the particular disease, which is the most common scenario encountered in ocular genetic disorders. So I would like to tell two stories to highlight how genetic evaluation helps us in day-to-day life. So my first story is about a common scenario, that is retinitis pigmentosa. Here is a 31-year-old male patient who was a known case of RP for the past 15 years with gradual deterioration of vision in seek of some hope ever since he was diagnosed with RP. Recent BCVA was 2200 in both eyes. Typical RP features, was on regular genetic counseling. Option of genetic testing was well explained to him, but due to the fact that it might not help him with therapy, he was not fully convinced to go for genetic testing at that time. Well, he came back to us when he was planning for a family to know the risk of occurrence in the child. This was the pedigree, which showed that he was the only person affected in the family for at least 3 generations, hinted towards a probable autosomal recessive or sporadic mutation. So we went ahead and did clinical exome sequencing for retinal dystrophy genes. It showed a pathogenic affection of RPE65 gene with the autosomal recessive pattern. Yes, after the test, there is a hope for the patient as RPE65 gene therapy is available. So the patient was happy. But at this point, the main objective of the test was for family planning. So we went ahead with spouse genetic testing and performed a targeted sequencing for variations in the RPE65 gene, which was detected in the husband. The spouse did not show variations in the RPE65 gene. So there was double happiness for both of them. And they can go for family planning with a 50% risk of child being born as just carrier and not affected at all. So this is one common scenario which helped us. The second case story is about a 7-year-old boy with features of low vision for the past 1 year. Also had history of myoclonic seizures and delayed developmental milestones. Both his fundus showed some RP degeneration changes, minimal attenuation of vasculature, autofluorescence showed some hyper regions, but not conclusive of anything. Well, ERG was subnormal. But by ocular and systemic phenotypical features, did not fit into syndromic RP at least. No history of deafness, balance abnormalities, obesity, polydactyly. So we were thinking of something else. We were dealing with something else. So the pedigree showed affected brother, equal affection of males and females in the previous generation, with unfortunately death of all of them. So we realized that something is definitely missing. Unlike the previous case, we did not know exactly what we are dealing with this. So instead of targeted gene sequencing for dystrophy, we went ahead with whole exome sequencing. And the sequencing showed homozygous frame shift mutation of CLN3 gene, which is causative of neuronal ceroid lipofuscinosis, a neurodegenerative lysosomal storage disorder, which is characterized by vision loss at 4 to 10 years of age, behavioral and cognitive dysfunction, seizures, and premature death. Among this, the visual will be mostly presenting as rod cone dystrophy in a dystrophy pattern. Visual rehabilitation was initiated and was referred for neurologists for systemic supportive therapy. This case clearly taught us the role of stepwise approach in genetics. So this is what I wanted to highlight in this talk. These were points for discussion which I had sent also. I thank all my team here, the retina team who deal with inherited retinal degenerations, and also our genetic counselor. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Deepika. That was a very insightful talk. I think we have 3 minutes left. Dr. Purna, one comment for this talk, please, since you did some work on genetics.
I just want to ask Deepika, if you get a variance of unknown significance, how do you go about it?
Yes. Yes, Dr. Purna, I was expecting that question from the RP picture, which I thought. So in the patient which we saw, one was pathogenic, other was unknown significance. So in those cases, the best is to go for a sibling test, or we have to test both the parents. So if we find that variance of unknown sequencing in any of the parent, then we are in the right pathway, but also in any of the siblings. But if we don't find, then we have to go back and check our genes that have we missed something else which is there? Because in autosomal recessive, for it to manifest, we should have a homozygous this thing.
Purva, I said only one comment. Over.
No, we'll go back to the previous talks. So, Nilesh, I was asking in the chat box about whether there are examples of adoption of blockchain used in the medical field. Any
Yes,
of-
ma'am. Yeah, there are some 15 to 20 startups in India working right now on blockchain. Mostly they are doing EMR and EHR, and they are doing that transportation and logistics solutions. So they are working on that. So, but I think next 2 to 3 years, blockchain is going to come in a big way. Not more than that.
Nilesh, one thing, I mean, this blockchain concept or the startups, I mean, to what level do you think, I mean, is it very specific to, at what level it should be? Whether it should be at specific to a hospital or an institutional or an,
No, sir,
I mean,
Yeah. So I got the question. It should be a consortium kind of thing. So whatever a hospital is having, that should have a private blockchain, and the insurer will have their own private blockchain, all connected via some authority that has to come. So we can't have a public blockchain like Bitcoin.
Okay. Just last question for Sagnik. Can you just tell us exactly what you are using proteomics for, or is there any way forward about making a commercial panel? Not from your side exactly, but do you know of any rather?
Yeah. So I'll just give you the largest study in India currently, and Arvind is undertaking that with RC UK, Research Council for UK. So they have selected 12 proteins, a few apolipoproteins, few proteases, and few serpins. Like the exact, I won't go into the details of the functions, but previous mass spectrometry studies from blood, vitreous, and few ELISA Western blot studies have shown that some proteins are upregulated, some proteins are downregulated. So they have selected the highest upregulated and downregulated proteins, and they are trying to develop so they have taken around 500 patients with DME, without DME, in NPDR and PDR. So they are trying to study the levels of these proteins in different patients and try and develop a sensor. So it will be like you take blood from a patient, you will put that blood in the sensor system, and the sensor will tell you whether the patient has a risk of developing DME in future or not, or how much risk is there based on test and control. So basically proteomics assays are going to be something like this, sort of like TriDot for HIV, as for screening, something like that.
Okay.
Application will be for, like patient risk factor prediction, prognostic prediction, like that.
Correct. Thank you so much. Superb talks by everyone. Thanks for being part of this session. I think we have to wrap up. Thank you all the speakers, moderators, and thank you and Karan for being here. So we'll see you tomorrow at your pavilion. Thank you. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you all.